Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessen. This is Colorado State of Mind. Tonight, a program in 3 parts. In a few minutes, we'll bring you the first in our series of reports on Losing Ground, the newest investigative story from iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS. Laura Frank, Executive Director of iNews, will be here to explain more about the series and about our new direction here. But we begin with one of the more controversial pieces of legislation now in play at the state capitol, the Colorado Asset Bill, which is making another appearance after being defeated more than once in previous years. This time, the proposal is to allow undocumented college students the opportunity to pay in-state tuition rates as long as they have attended high school in Colorado for at least 3 years. Joining us to talk about it tonight, Representative Crisanta Duran, one of 31 sponsors of the bill, all of them Democrats. And let's just start with the difference in this year's bill, because before this, it had always come before the legislature as a third tier, something these undocumented students could pay that would be in between in-state and out-of-state. Why the change?
Well, last session, there was a version that was introduced in the Senate that defined a modified rate of tuition. However, many of the versions prior to the bill that was introduced last session did have in-state tuition. I think the reason why the version in the Senate started that way was in an effort to compromise with the Republicans, and unfortunately, at the end of the day, at the end of last session, the bill did die on a party line vote. And we know that cost means access when it comes to students being able to go to college. And so we wanted to come up with a version of the bill this year that was substantive and would enable these young students to have a real shot at having access to an affordable college degree. And so that was a driving concern, and we came back with a bill that is in-state tuition and will give these students a real shot at being able to go to college.
How many students are affected in Colorado?
At this point, we don't have specific numbers. We know that Metropolitan State University of Denver, who put in place a modified rate of tuition this last year, has seen over 500 students sign up for that rate of tuition who have not been able to prove residency. We're still waiting on the fiscal note, and we'll have a better sense of how many students we think that it will affect specifically in Colorado at that time.
You decided to run for the legislature 3 years ago precisely because of this bill and this effort. Why did you do that?
Well, this bill and many other issues concerning economic opportunity. But this bill in particular was very frustrating for me. This is going to be the 7th time that the bill is introduced in the Colorado legislature. And for me, the issue of immigration is very personal. I have 6 generations of family in the state of Colorado. But when I was working for an organization about 6 years ago in 2006, there was an immigration raid that took place at Swift & Company that affected meatpacking workers at that particular plant. And meatpacking workers who were doing nothing more than going to work that day to provide for themselves and their families were detained in an ICE immigration raid. And that day we saw families separated, and it was a clear signal to me that we have a broken immigration system in the state of Colorado and nationally. And Colorado Asset is one step closer to making sure that we have immigration reform at the federal level, but also at the state level, because some of the stories that have been brought forward through this legislation mean so much to me and mean so much to, I think, these students who have struggled so long to be able to go to college and have access to the American dream. Many of these students have lived in the United States for many, many years and really think of themselves as being American and part of American culture. And these students were not brought here due to any fault of their own. They were brought here by their parents, and so really didn't have a choice and have went to Colorado high schools, and we've invested in these students for them to get through Colorado high schools. And so now's the time to make sure that we have a return on our investment so they are able to go to college.
As you're certainly aware, the Republican opposition to this bill in previous years or this year is that it is somehow encouraging unlawful behavior. What do you say to that?
We have had a broken immigration system in this country for a very long time, and we should not penalize young people who are talented and who can give back to the community and prevent them from going to college. Also, for the first time, we have a deferred action order that was signed by President Barack Obama, so that not only will these undocumented students be able to stay in the country legally to go to school, but that also they will be able to find employment here through a work visa.
And you have made the economic portion of this a pretty big part of the reason it should be passed?
You know, we struggle in the state of Colorado to have a qualified workforce that meets the needs of business. And instead of having these students go to surrounding states that have already passed similar legislation, like New Mexico or like Texas, we should keep that talent in the state of Colorado, enable these students to go to college and institutions of higher ed, and give back to the economy here in Colorado.
Thank you very much, Representative Crisanta Duran, and of course we'll be watching where the Colorado Asset Bill goes from here. Coming up next, Republican Senator Ted Harvey, who will explain why the Republicans are maintaining their opposition to the Colorado Asset Bill. The way scheduling goes at the Capitol, it isn't easy to get a representative and a senator together during a busy legislative session, but we're very glad to be able to follow up after Crisanta Duran with Senator Ted Harvey of Douglas County. You are not in favor of passing this Colorado Asset Bill, so what is your main objection?
Well, first off, I don't think it's appropriate for the state of Colorado to be dealing with this immigration issue. It's more of a federal issue, not a state issue. But also, I think that we need to know what we're actually doing. We are giving another entitlement to people who have broken our country's laws and using taxpayer dollars to reward people for breaking our laws. And whenever you reward people for bad behavior, you encourage more bad behavior. And I think that that's just bad public policy. But more importantly, as a public policy maker, it is bad for us to be taking money from one individual and giving it to another individual who is not entitled to this government subsidy.
All right, let's break that down a little bit. In this case, the people who would stand to gain are, in most cases, I think, children who didn't break the law themselves but were brought here by their parents. So are they the ones who need to learn a lesson?
Well, it's the family that is getting the benefit. The parents aren't having to pay the full rate of that college education. The parents conscientiously, and I would do the same, came here to give a better opportunities for their family, and certainly they have done that. They came here for jobs, they came here for schooling, they get a free education for their kids from K through 12, and the taxpayers had to subsidize that. Now they are saying, well, let's give us one more taxpayer subsidy, and that's higher education paid for at in-state tuition rates. If we continue to do this and continue to give more benefits to people who break our laws, we are going to incentivize a whole nother generation of families to come here illegally. There are people coming here legally from all over the world, and they're doing it in the proper way. If we are going to give these kind of things to people who have broken our laws, why don't we give in-state tuition to all foreign nationals? It's not fair to them for us to be charging them an out-of-state international rate and then giving in-state tuition to these kids.
Would you amend the bill that way?
It wouldn't pass.
You don't think?
No, definitely not.
What's going to happen to this bill this
The
session?
universities get millions and millions of dollars from international students. They are not going, because we charge them a such higher rate than we do even out-of-state students, much less in-state students.
Part of the reasoning behind doing this is somewhat self-important, because it's important to ourselves that our economic future be saved from people who aren't educated and who don't have a way to do their part in the economy.
Well, I think I don't agree with that argument.
Okay.
I believe that it incentivizes more lower income, lower skilled workers to come here and work in the United States and get these benefits. So we're actually bringing in lower skilled workers, which are taking jobs from low income U.S. citizens, and it's incentivizing that kind of behavior. I believe that we should have borders. I believe that we should have the ability to invite the immigrants that we want to come in, high-skilled laborers, healthy laborers, non-criminal individuals. But in the ag communities or in the construction communities, we should require the agricultural producers and the construction companies to go through the process. There are visas for those kind of works to bring in low-skilled workers to be able to do those jobs legally and then be able to go back home.
There's a huge backup, though, right?
I agree. That's one of the biggest problems. We need to be putting pressure on the federal government to change the immigration visa process to allow ag workers and construction workers to be able to come up here on a more broad population than we are right now. That's a federal issue. I'm a state senator, not a U.S. senator, and I can't change that. But certainly, we should not, at the state level, be doing things that even exacerbate the problem even worse than it already is by giving incentives for more people to come here illegally.
There's a woman from your part of the state who has a big horse farm. And I can remember interviewing her about immigration some years ago.
Helen Kriebold.
That's it, Helen. And she said there should just be an employment agency at the border. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that is essentially what we are doing with the immigration process with H-1B visas for ag workers and stuff like that. But, like we just said, it's terrible in the way how small the number is that they're allowing people to come in. We need to open that up and lessen the paperwork and allow employers to be able to do it on a more broad scale. But that's not the issue of this bill.
So if down the line the federal government does try and improve some of these things, would you be in favor then if you knew that you were only offering it to a certain finite group of individuals?
If we closed off the border and made sure that it was secure so that we wouldn't have more illegal immigration coming in. The problem is if we did that once. Ronald Reagan did it in the 1980s when he gave amnesty to about 10 million people, saying, all right, this is the last time we're going to do this. We're going to stop the illegal immigration and we're going to allow this population to be normalized. Well, that didn't work. We now have upwards to 50 million illegal immigrants in the United States looking for help. And it is a tough situation. You know, a lot of these kids have been here a long time. They think of themselves as Americans. But if we do this, it's just to encourage an entire another generation, just like the Reagan policy did. And that's something that, is not good for America. We are a country of laws.
Thank you, State Senator Ted Harvey, and I'm sure we will talk again about immigration. Now, though, we turn our attention to Losing Ground, the news series you've no doubt heard about somewhere this week. It is a body of investigative data taken from the U.S. Census records, which shows a definite decline in opportunity for minority Colorado residents over the past 40 or 50 years. Losing Ground is the latest report from a 2-year-old news service called the Rocky Mountain Investigative News Network, led by Executive Director Laura Frank. Last week, Laura and her team at the iNews Network became iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS, and we're looking forward to many collaborations in the future. I'll be talking to Laura here in just a moment, but first, here is the first installment of Losing Ground from iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS.
We can point back to some of the post-civil rights gains, but also some of the advent of an introduction of some of the crack cocaine and some of the incarceration rates. thereby creating achievement gaps of our young people, thereby creating decreased graduation rates, and beginning to erase a lot of the gains, whether it was in home ownership, economic gains, a lot of things and a lot of ills that we are challenged with today.
There still is a major problem that's a concern, I think, to all of us, and that is the challenge that's come about in a society that involves high technology and places a premium on quality education. That shortfall in education, or the advantage of an education, makes a huge difference in salary. That is a concern, I think, to all Americans as you go forward.
You can overlay our investment in public schools and look at what we've been spending since 1980 and look at the achievement levels of the students at the same time period, and it's almost the same graph. 30 years from now, mid-century, we're going to see our country more brown and black than white. And if we are not investing in education for those students, we will not be able to compete globally. We're moving out of manufacturing, and that the job skills are becoming more and more demanding.
The out-of-wedlock birth rate is a travesty. It's a national tragedy. It's now up to, in some places, 65 to 70%.
We need to get back to the real values, no matter how bad things got with those families during the civil rights movement, whether it was economically or in the family, that those families, one, stuck close to their faith and their practice of their faith. Two, they stuck together as a family. It took hell and high water for Dad to be removed from that family.
And I mean, we have like $5.26 to kind of work with for the month, so I try to, I basically just hit the sales and then I'll go for other stuff outside of that, a little here, a little there.
If you knew that a single parenthood, being brought up in a single parent home, is a very strong predictor of poverty, you would be outraged. You'd say that was horrible. You would want to do something about that.
In our neighborhood, in our council district, it's 80%, 76, 80% Latino in a lot of areas. It's hard to think that there's not other factors in this. That's why the civil rights movement is alive and well, because we have yet to reach parity in some areas of this city and this state.
So there is the first installment of Losing Ground. And we're very proud to say here at Rocky Mountain PBS that we are gaining ground or doing something ground shifting, some sort of metaphor there. This is Laura Frank, Executive Director of the iNews Network, and we are very glad to, you've been in the building for a couple of years. Now we are officially a unit.
That's right. It's iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS, and we're just as thrilled as you are.
Oh, that's great. So let's go on here to Losing Ground. These are just kind of staggering numbers, the way you've put them together. Poverty, education, home ownership. When you first started looking at it, what jumped out at you?
Well, this was something that we started looking at, not with the idea of doing this expansive project, but we began to look at census data, and we were noticing widening gaps, and we kept going back to earlier and earlier years. And for many of these measurements, as you just saw, for home ownership, income, poverty, education, the gaps continually are widening, which kind of goes against what you might have expected. So I think what really stood out to us were the widening gaps in college education, because that seems to be key to so many of the other issues.
And the gateway to other fortunes, yes.
Exactly. And so right now in Colorado, whites have there are 3 times as many whites with college educations compared to Latinos, and the black rate, whites are double the rate for African Americans, and so that has just been such a dramatic change, and the impact reverberates through all of these other issues.
And why is that? I mean, is the detail found in the other measures about how things have shifted?
Well, this was really the difficult part of losing ground, because the numbers are what they are. You can look every year at the census data, federally collected data, the best source of information we have about these kinds of things. But then when you begin to ask the questions, why? They're complex and interrelated, as you saw in the video piece. People have lots of different ideas, and they aren't clearly delineated. All of these things are related. So education is related to government policy, is related to changes in family structure and changes in the economy, and the full impact are these widening gaps, this eroding disparity in Colorado.
You interviewed quite a long list of people in Colorado, some of whom the audience will know. Hank Brown is in there, the mayor of Denver, of course, a lot
Wellington Webb, yes, right, exactly. Michael Hancock, the current mayor. There are a lot of people, and that's what we tried to do, to get as many voices from across the spectrum, and any kind of spectrum you can think of, political, economic, and so on. Because these things tend to be so complex. And so it was a chance for us to reach out. We did something different in this report, Cynthia, and that was bring people in before the report was done. And when we had just really done some of the analysis of the data and say, here's what we're finding. What might be some of the causes for that? And we're doing something very different on the end of this project, and that is community engagement. So we're having multiple events around the state where people can come together and talk about what losing ground showed them and what it means for the future and what they might want to do about it.
This is the exciting thing about iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS, are these major projects which we can reach out and engage the community in. And as I mentioned earlier, you have seen losing ground start to be reported all over the state this week, and that is because of Laura's model for how iNews works. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, we really are about service. So iNews tries to look at those issues that have broad impact across the state, are important issues people need to know about, and then tell each community how it impacts them. So you could read this story in most of the daily newspapers around the state this week. You could hear it on public radio. You could watch it not only here on Rocky Mountain PBS, but also some of our other partners, like Channel 9 here in Denver. So it was a multimedia offering of this topic to let people start the conversation now and then follow up with these events around the state.
Well, we're very, very glad to be ground zero, if I may indulge in another metaphor. And I also want to point out that all of this work that the iNews team has done can be found at our website, rmpbs.org. Laura, looking again at some of the facets of losing ground, as I mentioned, you talked to all these various people. Now, Mayor Hancock is fairly young. Wellington Webb has been around a long time. What did he say about how this gap developed?
Well, there were lots of different takes on it, and generationally, some folks felt that maybe some of the work that was done during the civil rights movement has been let up on. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but some of the work hasn't felt as urgent in recent decades as it maybe did in the 60s and into the 70s.
So some vigilance has been dropped. Oh, my goodness.
That was one of the theories. But there are others, too. Our public policies changed dramatically from the 60s and 70s through the 80s and 90s. And that's what we saw in the data. We could see that gaps were bad at the time of the civil rights movement. They began to get better in the 60s and 70s, and then they began to widen again in the 80s and 90s.
This is fascinating. I mean, it's like we all get a big sociological and historical lesson out of this. Right?
It has been, and there's a lot of history. If you go online to RockyMountainPBS.org, you can find an interactive timeline that will actually show you some of the major events of the civil rights movement.
Oh, that's very exciting. And did you plan it to debut with the week of Martin Luther King's birthday?
Well, we actually, in the beginning, were not planning that. It's just a matter of how quickly can we put all of these elements together into one package that gives people what they need to know. But it turned out that that's when it was. So this was a topic that a lot of people have been talking about this week, from President Obama during the inauguration all the way to the local events here in Colorado. So this was a topic on a lot of people's minds this week.
Well, we are going to talk more about it in the upcoming weeks of Colorado State of Mind. For this week, that is the program, and thank you for joining us. Next week in this space, it's Colorado Quarterly with Doug Price. His guests include the Reverend Leon Kelly and the Catholic Archbishop of Denver, Reverend Samuel Akia, talking about character development in young people. Then the following week, February 8th, we'll be back with part 2 of Losing Ground as we continue this series. You can find this program again online at video.rmpbs.org. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.
One thing I would want to let people know is there's an entire ebook that they can go to the website and download and read not only the whole entire Losing Ground package, all 4 parts, which are now 4 chapters in the ebook, but also all of those interviews that you mentioned. 40+ interviews are available, and the community engagement kit is in the back. So if people want to have their own conversations, there are conversation guides and Q&A, a fact list, whatever you would need.
How many people did it take to put this all together?
A lot of people.